Today's fundamental braiding skills tutorial is about the family of braids called interwoven braids. These essentially are normal braids like the rope or 4-strand, but there is another strand weaving through these patterns that give it a new look. The basic concept for creating these braids is to separate off some hair and start braiding the rest of it. Braid the hair in front of the separated chunk for one iteration of that braid, then behind the chunk, then in front again, and so on. In the case of this braid I'm doing here, I'm using 2 strands like I would in a rope braid. Bringing each strand around the outside of the interwoven chunk of hair, I cross the left over the right so they switch positions. Then I bring them back around the interwoven chunk to behind it, and again cross the left strand over the right. This is a 3-strand interwoven braid. Finishing it up looks like this. If keeping these strands distinct from each other is giving you difficulty, or if you want the braid to have a more unique look, you can make a combo braid version. This just means you have smaller braids working as individual strands in the larger braid. If you do the same pattern as before with the 3-strand interwoven braid and make the crossing strands little braids themselves, you get a finished braid that looks like this. Interwoven braids can be done with multi-strand braid patterns too. Here I'll do a 5-strand interwoven braid with a transverse 4-strand braid as the base pattern. If you don't know how to do that one, I have a tutorial on it that you can follow. I'll start with the braiding strands as smaller braids so you can see what I'm doing better. First, bring 2 strands around one side of the interwoven chunk and 2 strands around the other side. Then do one iteration of a 4-strand transverse braid in front of this chunk, which involves bringing the outer right strand over the inner right, under the inner left, and over the outer right. Then bring the left 2 strands around the left side of the interwoven chunk to the back, and the right 2 strands around the right side. Behind this chunk, do another iteration of the braid. Outer right strand goes over the inner right, under the inner left, and over the outer right. Bring the strands around the interwoven chunk again to the front and repeat. Like I mentioned earlier, you can do an interwoven braid with pretty much any base braid pattern that you know. They look best though if you use a braid with an even number of strands. If you use an odd number of strands, like in a 3-strand braid, that means you have to bring 1 strand around one side of the interwoven chunk and 2 strands around the other side, which would make the braid uneven looking. Finishing up the 5-strand version, you get a braid that looks like this. This is one of my most favorite braid looks ever. Finally, let's try an interwoven braid from a different family of braid patterns. Here I'll use a fishtail technique. Bringing my 2 fishtail halves around and in front of the interwoven chunk, I'm going to do 4 iterations of a fishtail braid here so that you can see the fishtail pattern clearly. Then I bring them back around the chunk to the back side and do 4 more iterations. Repeat this down the length of the braid. The trickier part of all interwoven braids is avoiding hair in the interwoven chunk. You can use gravity to help yourself with this. When you're braiding in front of the interwoven chunk, lift the braid strands up a little bit so the interwoven chunk stays falling behind. When you're braiding behind the chunk, lean forward a bit so the free hanging interwoven chunk falls forward away from your hands. And for one final tip, you can vary the size of the interwoven chunk to change up the look of the braid. If you make it more than half your hair, the finished braid looks like a tube of hair that has little detailed braids woven around it. If you make the interwoven strand smaller, it looks like it has just been threaded through a normal braid. This would look cute if you use a ribbon or string of beads for the interwoven part instead of hair. There's lots of room for creativity here, so try it out. This video is a part of a basic braiding tutorial series I'm doing as a 12 Days of Christmas event at the end of 2016. So if you like this video, come back to this channel every day for a new braid to learn. Or if it's past 2016 by now, you can check out all of these basic braiding tutorials in the playlist over to the right, as well as some other hair tricks and tips videos in there for basic hairstyling advice. Thanks for watching and happy braiding!